Oh, this is it! My time to shine. As a fully fledged Brit who has used an original Amiga for many years during its heyday, I'm very excited at the release of the A500 Mini, a tiny recreation of the classic Commodore home computer. This was brought to us by RetroGames, who also did the C64, which you may have heard of, and that turned out to be a rousing success with its target audience. But while the original C64 back in the 80s had seen stellar success across many markets across the world, the Amiga, well, it really only took off in Europe, and more specifically in two areas, Germany and, you guessed it, the UK. So as someone who's in the specific target demographic for one of these, and someone who has actually used an Amiga, almost every day, in my own home, for quite a few years, I'd like to think I can tell whether this is worth it or not. So hello fellow gamers, and from someone who actually has Amiga experience, is the A500 Mini worth it? In the UK in the 80s and early 90s, game consoles weren't the first choice for video games. I mean, sure, we had them, but most of us used home computers instead. Mainly because it was really simple to copy the games. That, by the way, US viewers, is the reason why we weren't affected by your video game crash back in 1983. We were just too busy with our ZX Spectrums or Commodore 64s to really notice. Now, the Commodore Amiga, this was the home computer that succeeded the Commodore 64. RetroGames had brought out a mini version of that too, and I've had a lot of fun with it, but I decided not to review it. Because you see, it wouldn't be fair for me to review a miniature version of an old computer if I haven't got hands-on experience with that old computer. Would it? However, my experience of the Amiga comes from the A500 Plus, which released in 1992. It was a minor upgrade from the original A500. The bundle we got in particular was the Cartoon Classics one, which came with Lemmings, Captain Planet, Bart vs Space Mutants, and the early 90s equivalent of Photoshop, Deluxe Paint 3. So, armed with real-world experience with a real-world Amiga, let's see if RetroGames have pulled it off. Alright, let's quickly see what we've got in here. Okay, so we've got the Amiga itself, we've got a gamepad reminiscent of the CD32's gamepad, a recreation of the original Amiga mouse, and some power and HDMI cables. The Amiga Mini itself is a damn near perfect tiny recreation of the original. I mean, I should know, I've still got my original Amiga, and, well, that really could do with a little bit of retro bright, couldn't it? Anyway, I say it's a damn near perfect recreation. The keys on here aren't functional. They're just for show, like they were on the C64. Around the back, obviously you're not going to find the various different serial and parallel ports found on Amigas of old. Instead, you're treated to a more familiar ports, 3 USB, a HDMI, and a Type-C USB port for power. On the base here is a sticker with its serial number. As you can see, I didn't get one of the early releases that some people got. So yeah, I paid out of my own pocket for this, so you know that what I'm going to say is unbiased. The gamepad included with this Amiga may look a bit strange to some, but this has been designed to look and behave similarly to the gamepad that came with the CD32, Amiga's failed attempt at a games console. But, I mean, the gamepad itself does the job. There's more than enough buttons here to let you play all of the included games, of which there are 25 of them, but I have to admit, it's not the most comfortable to use. The mouse is a slightly scaled down version of the original iconic Amiga mouse, complete with its jagged edges and clicky buttons. It's a modern recreation though, so instead of being a ball mouse, this one is optical. And you know, it works really well, especially with those point and click adventures like Simon the Sorcerer. It was nice to see a HDMI cable included in the box, and you know, something that's a really nice little detail here is just how beige everything is, you know? The 80s and 90s was the era of beige computers, And it's good to see this continued with the A500 Mini, its peripherals and its cabling. But what's probably not so nice is the lack of a power brick. Having said that, this runs off USB power, and we've all got USB ports dotted everywhere anyway, so you can just power it off one of those instead. For example, for much of my initial time with the A500 Mini, I've just been powering it off my Xbox One, and it didn't falter. And besides, if you're anything like me, you've probably got power strips that have USB ports already included on them. So once the A500 Mini is powered up, what has it got to offer? Well, when booting the Mini up, you're presented with this side-scrolling menu allowing you to browse through all of the available games. Each of the titles shows some game artwork, a description, and details on what inputs to use and how many players it supports. Quick presses up and down on the controller will reveal the controls for the game and any saves that you've got stored. And yes, you can store 4 saves for every game, so you'll never have to start from the beginning ever again. Well, except when you are first playing them on here, of course. A press of the menu button reveals the settings, where you can make various different changes such as the picture size and apply a surprisingly accurate CRT filter, as well as set the refresh rate. Now, to be honest, for this, you're always going to want to choose 50Hz, regardless of where you are in the world. That's because most of these games were made for the European market, which had screens running at, well, you guessed it, 50Hz. Setting this is going to give you a much smoother experience. Now, speaking of the games, this little Amiga comes with 25 games built in and ready to play. There's everything from platformers to sports games, scrolling shoot-'em-ups, adventure titles, and even a first-person shooter, so there's a little something for everyone in here, and all of them have that classic Amiga charm baked right in. Now, out of all of the games that are listed, I've got first-hand experience with about 13 of them, so these are the best ones for me to judge against to see how well the emulation is on this. Now, I have been through every single game, and I can happily say that they all seem to work brilliantly. Classics like Zool and Speedball 2 run absolutely flawlessly. Other than skipping a lot of the loading time that plagued all of us when we were loading games from floppy disks back then, it's really like playing on an original Amiga again. Well, except for a couple of exceptions, but thankfully they're only small mistakes that don't take away from enjoying the games. The first thing that irked me was something I spotted in another world. Now, don't get me wrong, the game itself, it runs perfectly, but the intro, it just runs too quickly, which causes it to go out of time with the music. Now, when I played this back in the 90s on the original Amiga, the rhythmic beeping near the end of the theme would start right when the timer started counting down from 20, suggesting it's the beeping of the timer that we're hearing, rather than being a piece of the music. Apparently, this was also an issue when running the game on an A1200, so I guess it would be similar when trying to emulate these games on faster machines too. Otherwise, the game just runs fine. Another music problem was one I spotted in Project X. Now, this was one of my all-time favourite games on the Amiga back in the day, so I've played it countless times. So it will come as no surprise to you that I immediately noticed that there was no music playing between the levels. You know, the bits where the story is being explained to the player. Again, not a big deal, but as a veteran, its absence was painfully obvious. There's also the puzzling decision to include games on here that couldn't have been played on an original A500. There are at least 2 AGA games included in this selection, Alien Breed 3D and the AGA version of the Chaos Engine. Now, Alien Breed 3D I can kinda get, because it was one of the Amiga's better Doom clones, but it is a game A500 owners couldn't play because it would only work on newer Amigas with the AGA chipset. But this AGA version of the Chaos Engine, it's not necessary. I mean, sure, AGA games benefited from a greater colour palette, but the original OCS version you'll find on an A500, well, that looked darker, and it was definitely more fitting to its steampunk theme. There's also another issue that affects pretty much every game you can play on this. You may have already spotted it in the footage, but there is a noticeable vertical shimmer ever present when playing each of these games. The game where it's most noticeable is Pinball Dreams, where the pinball table is constantly scrolling up and down during play. Now this comes as a result of the full screen display option, where the game is scaled to fill up your TV from top to bottom, but the scaling doesn't seem to be that great. Now this problem, it doesn't present itself with the other two screen display options, where the games are presented all lovely and sharp and they lack that vertical shimmer. And well, of course, you could always hide that shimmer using the CRT effect if you really wanted to. But it is a shame that the shimmer is there when playing in full screen, which is likely the option that most people are going to go for. Hopefully this can be fixed in a firmware update in the future. The rest of the games featured here though, well, they're a decent selection, and luckily for RetroGames, this is a review of the device itself rather than the games that came with it. That's because Amiga experts, well like myself, will notice right away that there are better games that could have been added to this instead what we ended up getting. You know, like Sensible Soccer instead of Kickoff 2, or Monkey Island 2 instead of Simon the Sorcerer. But we have to remember that there are such things as license agreements that would limit what can be added to the A500 Mini initially. Well, now I can hear you asking the question, what do you mean, initially? Well, I mean, if you want to expand your game library, you're free to just bung in a USB stick full of your own. The first time you do this, you'll be directed to a set of instructions on how to get them running, but once that's out of the way, you can expand the A500 Mini's own game library to include, well, any others from the Amiga's extensive selection. To try this out, I stuck about 40 odd games in LHA format on a USB stick from my own collection, and I'm happy to report that pretty much every one of them worked. Now, I was very surprised at this because even some of these I struggled to run on an emulator on my own computer. Not so with the A500 Mini, they just worked. There were one or two that didn't work, which instead showed me this screen, but maybe I just need to recheck these files to make sure they're okay. Every game built in on the A500 Mini has already got preset settings and controls, but you have full control over these whenever running a game off a USB stick. You can adjust the position of the picture, configure what's connected into the virtual controller ports, and even adjust the memory settings in case the game doesn't play very well with too much or too little RAM. You can also remap the controller, which is extremely handy in games that require some limited keyboard input. I mean, sure, you can use the virtual keyboard, but why bother when you can just assign function keys to your controller? There's even a secondary set of buttons you can map, which can be accessed by holding down the right shoulder button during play, essentially doubling the number of buttons you can map. Well, now I can hear you asking, well, what if I want to use a different controller? Am I stuck with the one that comes with this? Well, to find out, I tried a whole bunch of my own controllers to see if they would work on an A500 Mini. Now, back when I was playing on the Amiga, one of my controllers of choice was this Zipstick joystick, as I'm sure it was for many Amiga users back then. Now sadly, the A500 Mini didn't come with an actual joystick, but the C64 Mini before it did. And sure enough, it plugs in, and it works well. I did encounter problems with it though. For the main built-in games, the two main fire buttons on the front of this joystick seem to be mapped to primary and secondary button inputs. The primary, such as for things like shooting, jumping or accelerating, on the right one, and the secondary, for stuff like opening doors or applying the brakes, are on the left button. Now, maybe I'm just weird, but I've always operated joysticks like this with my right hand, whilst holding it and pressing the fire button with my left. As such, this meant that I didn't have easy access to that primary button, which is rather awkward for many of the games on here. It's not so much of a problem for games loaded from the USB, because I can fully map the controls with those, but it's not possible with the built-in games. You know, it would be nice to be able to map the controls for those as well. My next controller of choice from way back then was a Mega Drive controller. A what? Yep, Mega Drive controllers work just fine on an Amiga. Both systems use the same controller connector, and inputs from a Mega Drive controller were recognised in practically every Amiga game. So this led me to try the controller that came with my Mega Drive Mini, which is also USB. Sadly, this didn't work. None of the inputs were recognised. Damn it. So I spread out and I tried a few other controllers. The Tribute 64 seemed like a good wireless option, as it would be able to connect using that wireless USB dongle. Unfortunately, only a couple of the buttons worked, and all they did was just change the number of stars I could give a game. I guess that one's out too. I also gave one of my 8-bit door controllers a whirl, but sadly that wasn't recognised either. One controller that did work, surprisingly, was the PS1 Classic controller. It did have a bit of a mind of its own while in the main menu, but once I was in a game, all of the buttons mapped up perfectly to the ones on the default gamepad. It's definitely more comfortable than the one that comes with the A500 Mini, so this might be a good choice for you if you already have a PS1 Classic and you want a second player to join you. This led me to try the PS3's DualShock 3, which sadly didn't work. However, the PS4's DualShock 4, it worked perfectly everywhere, in the menus, in-game, not a single problem. I could even use the analog stick to play the game rather than the D-pad. It's definitely made playing Project X a lot easier. Unfortunately, when moving on to the PS5's DualSense controller, sadly that doesn't work. It had a similar issue to the Tribute 64 where only a couple of the buttons worked, and all it would do was just change the rating of the game. Not to leave out Microsoft's offerings, I also tried the Xbox One and Xbox Series controllers, both of which sadly got no response from the A500 Mini. So in short, other controllers that work with the A500 Mini are the C64 joystick, the PS1 Classic controller, and a DualSense 4 when connected via USB. The latter of all these is by far the best option in my opinion. The A500 Mini and C64 joysticks are also available separately if you want to go down that route. Oh, and let's not forget a keyboard. Any typical USB keyboard should work fine with this, and it's much easier using one of these than resorting to that virtual keyboard. Wow, okay, I covered a lot more than I was expecting to, so let's sum this up. The A500 Mini does a lot of things right. It includes a good variety of games, some of them are even gems. It's easy to use, and you can expand upon it with your own games and even use a number of different input methods. Not to mention that it's all bundled into a tiny replica of the iconic Amiga 500. Having this tiny little Amiga sat on the desk or shelf brings with it a flood of nostalgia simply by just looking at it. And even in the years ahead you get fed up of playing games on it, it's a lovely piece of nostalgic eye candy. On the flip side, some of the games are, well, less than stellar. Better alternatives to these games are available, but licenses sadly put a stop to that. So newcomers who don't expand the library won't be experiencing the best games for the platform. There's also that vertical shimmering issue plaguing the full screen display option, which does become annoying in games where there's a lot of vertical movement. It also seems to be mainly focused on games, but the Amiga was also home to a number of different powerful applications for the time. Some of these can be added after the fact, but the biggest omission here is Workbench. There's no sign of it outside the graphical details we see in the main menus. It would have been nice if they included this too, even just for those of us who want to experience it again. And that, at the heart of it, is what the A500 Mini is all about. In summary though, with all things said and done, the A500 Mini is a remarkable attempt at a tiny modern Amiga, with its shortcomings all potentially fixable through firmware upgrades, which RetroGames tells us are going to be coming out regularly. As an Amiga aficionado, I've had a lot of fun with this. It was a joy revisiting a lot of the games from my youth, which I probably haven't played in over 25 years, and it was surprisingly easy to pick up and use. Now that's not to say it's not for everyone. If you've already gone through the trouble of getting all of your Amiga games running on a modern computer with the right firmwares and versions of Kickstarter and so on that you need, this likely won't interest you that much. And you've really got to have nostalgia for the Amiga to even consider this because, well, if you don't, then I'm sure you'll find a better way to spend 120 quid. However, this is an excellent way to jump right back into the days of the beloved Amiga, all bundled into this beautifully recreated replica and without all of the complications that come from trying to run Amiga games on other platforms. So would I recommend it? Well, only if you're nostalgic or even just a little bit interested in the Amiga. If you want to revisit the Amiga again, definitely. If you're intrigued by the Amiga or always wanted one, this is a great option if you want to jump into it hassle-free. But hey, what about you guys? Did you pick up an A500 Mini? Or maybe you've got experience with the original Amiga and you've got some game recommendations for us all. Let everyone know down below in the comments. And, well, while you're down there, please leave a like if you like the video, and, there's always that subscribe button if you want to hear more from me. Thanks again for watching, and I'll catch you all next time.